and welcome to Barnstar Sampler month number 7. Hard to believe it's been 7 months already. Alrighty, anyway, today we are going to be working on blocks number 4 and 13. So block number 4 is here and here, and we're going to be making 2 of them. And block number 14, we're actually making 3 of them. They're an 8-inch block, so they're a smaller block. And we've got one here. There's another one. I had it before in my mind. Right there. And on the other side with this that's flipped over, there's one on that side. So we're making 3 of these and 2 of these. So these are 16-inch blocks and these are 8s. So if we flip to the page, as always, block number 4, we're making 2. It gives us the fabric requirements for 2, but then the cutting instructions for just 1. So for the fabric requirements for this block, we are going to need a 10-inch square of gold, or of course, whatever fabric you decide you want. So this is my fabric 11, and then I'm using my pale gray background with the little dots on it. So this is my fabric number 24. Then we need a fat quarter of what she's calling a fat quarter of raspberry floral. I decided I was going to go a little bit pinkier. This is kind of a nice little dusty rose. This is my fabric number 5. And then a nice dark fabric. This is my fabric number 9. And I am using this, which is got a pinky little swirl in there. This is my fabric number 2. So for this, I need a 10-inch square. For this, 3/8 of a yard, a fat quarter, and a fat eighth. So gather up all your fabrics and let's get started with that cutting. And once we have finished all of block number 4, then we will go on to the fabric requirements and the cutting for block 13. So off we go. Get your fabrics ready. I know before I do any cutting, I'm going to spend a little bit of time at the ironing board because these are pretty wrinkly. So off I go to the ironing board. Okay, here I am back from the ironing board. Now, before we get cutting, I just want to talk a little bit about pressing and dark colors. So this color that I'm using here that's really, really dark, there might be a chance that this one could be what could be a runner. So if I'm using any of my dark fabrics, navies, really dark reds, dark purples, those are notorious for running. And what I mean by running, it's the color will run after, and nothing will make you sadder than putting all that work into a quilt and then finding you have one fabric in it that runs after you've washed it. So I always want to check for color fastness before I put any fabric into my quilt. So what I do is I just take a cotton ball and I wet the end of it and I'll rub it really hard against my piece of fabric. And if there's any color transfer onto my cotton ball, that fabric gets washed with a fixative before I use it. Or if I'm in a spot where I want to work on the quilt right now and I haven't washed this fabric, well, then I will just get another piece of fabric. So you always want to check your darks. Another thing is this particular one right here. I have tested it for color fastness and it's fine. It had been folded up into a fat quarter, really pretty from the store. But it was really hard to get those creases out. And the creases that are really hard to come out, you know, the one where the bolt is folded in half and you get that really strong crease when you take the fabric home. Those are the kind of creases that I'm talking about. Well, I was ironing this for a bit and that wasn't happening. So I grabbed my Acorn Precision Piecing Easy Press fabric. And I have this in a little squirter spray bomb. And I just put that onto the fabric and voila, I apply some heat and out it comes. So the really strong creases come out really, really quickly. Now this is very similar to what we used to use is Best Press. But this is a Canadian-made product out in Saskatchewan. So it's locally, well, somewhat locally made, locally to Canada. And it doesn't tend to stretch the fabric that Best Press sometimes tends to. If I really have to soak with the Best Press and then I'm pressing, because we don't iron, we press. If I'm pressing and I've kind of like soaked it with the Best Press, sometimes the Best Press will stretch my fabrics a little bit, which is not necessarily a big deal before I cut them. but it is a big deal after I cut them. So if I was, again, putting this into a piece, let's say we did a half square triangle, and I pressed this afterwards and had to use some Best Press or the Acorn Precision on it, and it could stretch then. So we don't want that to happen. So I have tended to switch over to Acorn Precision piecing, and kind of using up my Best Press, and I will use this in the future. So now let's do some cutting. So our first fabric is the gold, or fabric 11, whichever you're using for fabric 11. And all we need from this is 8 2 by 2 inch squares. So if you have, I actually just have a piece that I had kicking around. It's not a 10-inch square, it's not a fat quarter, it's just a piece of scrap. I am just going to cut, let's see, how big is this? Oh, it's about 18 inches across, which is like similar to a fat quarter, but all you're going to need is 1 2-inch strip of your gold, because we really just need 8 2-inch squares. So as long as the strip you have is bigger than 16 inches, you're good to go. So let's get rid of that salvage. Actually, it's not salvage, it's just a raw edge. Let's get rid of that. And then I just want to cut a 2-inch strip. That can go back into my bag. And now we'll cut this into 8 2-inch squares. So I'm going to actually leave it folded. Tidy up my raw edge. And then I'm just going to cut 2-inch squares. And we need a total of 8 of these. Now sometimes when you are pressing especially, you want to be as careful with the iron as you can to not stretch your fabrics. There we go. There's 8. We're going to label those A, stick them off to the side. So our next fabric is going to be your background fabric, whichever one you're working with. And from this we need, this is full width of fabric, and we need 1 1.5-inch strip. Of course, I have already tidied up my raw edge. This is a fabric that I've cut before, so my raw edge was good to go. And now we need 2 2.5-inch strips. And 1 3.5-inch strip. There we go. Now you can take your background, put it back into the bag. And what we are going to do is start with the 1.5-inch strip, and we are going to cut it up into 8 1.5 by 2-inch squares. So we'll just lay that strip down. Get rid of your nasty edge. Oh, I don't know if I got rid of enough of my nasty edge. What you always want to check when you're getting rid of your nasty edge is that you take the full salvage into account to get rid of that. And I did not go deep enough because this fabric tends to have a fairly deep salvage. So I'm just going to cut that off. There we go. And now we are going to cut that into 8 2-inch squares. There's 6. Hey, when I say squares, I mean rectangles. You can't have a 1.5 by 2-inch and still have it be a square. That would be rectangles we're cutting it into. 8 1.5 by 2-inch rectangles. And we are going to label these B and stick them off to the side. So B is in Bravo. Now we're going to take the rest of that 1.5-inch strip and we are going to cut 3-inch rectangles. And we also need 8 of those. after working on all those really big 24-inch blocks, this seems like such a small amount of cutting. I keep second guessing myself as if we actually have enough. And we do. We're going to label these, the 1.5 by 3s, we're going to label them C and stick them off to the side. Now we're going to grab the 2.5-inch strips, and from these 2.5-inch strips, we need 32 2.5-inch squares. So again, get rid of your salvage, cut that off, and then go ahead and cut 32 2.5-inch squares. And there we go, 32 2.5-inch squares. We are going to put them off to the side and label them F as in Frank. And now we just have the 3.5-inch strip of background to cut up. And we are cutting 8 3.5 by 4 strips. So again, we're doing rectangles, not squares. This time we want to do 3.5 by 4. And 8. So grab those, put them off to the side, and they are going to be labeled I as in indigo. All right, and that's all the cutting we need to do for the background. So just make sure you've got all those squares labeled. No, all these rectangles and some squares labeled. And we will move on to the next color, which is raspberry floral, or fabric number 5, whichever you go by. So for your fabric number 5, if you are doing full width of fabric, you will need 2 2.5-inch strips. Technically you need 1.5-inch strips, but we don't usually cut a 1/2-inch strip. So 2 2.5-inch strips, and then we're just going to cut 2 3.5-inch squares. If you are cutting from a fat quarter, which is what I'm doing right here, you will need hopefully just 3 2.5-inch strips. It depends on your fat quarter, and we've talked about that in the past. 3 for sure, possibly 4 depending on your fat quarter. So when I'm cutting my fat quarter, I'm folding it as if this were width of fabric. So there's my salvage here. If this was width of fabric, my other salvage would be on this side. So I'm folding it salvage to salvage as if it were width of fabric. Okay, so go ahead and cut 2 2.5-inch strips if you're doing width of fabric, and 3 2.5-inch strips if you are doing fat quarter, possibly 4. We'll find out. Tidy up the raw edge. And again, since I am doing a fat quarter, I'm going to start by cutting 3. Hopefully that will be enough. Now I did double check the width of my fat quarter before I got started. I'm actually going to need 4 strips for this particular fat quarter to get all the squares that I need. So there's my 4 2.5-inch strips, and now I want to cut 2 3.5-inch squares. Well, with a fat quarter, I'm just going to open this up. I can get that from the leftover width of my fat quarter, which, having done this, might be the reason that my original fat quarter wasn't as wide as it should have been. I might have already taken something off of there. We're not sure. So go ahead and we're going to cut 2 3.5-inch squares. And I say I'm just going to take that off the end of my fat quarter. Take this, stick it back into my bag. And now from this little piece that I have right here, I am just going to tidy up my edge right there just to square it off. And I'm just going to go ahead while I have this down here and cut my 2 3.5-inch squares. Ooh, how's that for not a whole lot of waste? I do like when that happens. Okay, get rid of this stuff here. So my 2 3.5-inch squares that I have cut, I am going to label those K and stick them off to the side. And now I'm going to grab my 2.5 inch strips. And again, because I'm working with a fat quarter, I want to actually layer a couple of my strips. If you're working with yardage, they're already layered. So you'd be cutting 2 squares at once. So that's all I'm doing with my fat quarter, is just laying a strip on top of a strip so that I actually have 2 pieces of fabric lined up. I don't necessarily want to cut each and every individual square. So what we're going to do is we are going to cut 8 3-inch rectangles. Again, I keep calling them squares. They're rectangles. And 2.5 by 3. 6. I need one more set of those. And now from the remainder, I want 8 2.5 by 5. So go ahead, cut those. I'm going to have to break into my other 2 strips, which I knew I'd have to do. Lay them down all nice and neat. Make sure they're on top of one another. And I want 8 total. 2, there's 4 total, 6 and 8. There we go. Okay, so the 2.5 by 3s, we're going to label them D. And the 2.5 by 5s, we are going to label them E as in Edward. Stick them off to the side. Okay, now we are ready to cut our next fabric. And it is fabric number 9. In my case, it's going to be this dark floral, or dark burgundy. And I have, again, I'm folding my fat quarter as if it were salvage to salvage. Now, if you are going from with the fabric, you will need, well, 2.5 inch strips. So just go ahead and cut 3. 2.5 inches is a great size to keep in your scrap bin for other uses. So 3 2.5 inch strips. If you are cutting from a fat quarter, again, depending on the width of your fat quarter, we should be able to get away with 4 2.5 inch strips. So I am just going to go ahead and tidy up this edge. This is kind of a nasty little fat quarter. There we go. And now I want to cut 4 2.5 inch strips. There we go. There's my 4 2.5 inch strips. I'm going to keep this just pretty close just in case I need that little bit more if I make a miscellaneous boo-boo. And we are going to now subcut these into 8 2.5 by 5s. So again, line up your strip. I am going to put 2 together because I'm working with that fat quarter. Just want to make sure that you're lining everything nice and neat up on top of one another. And that is where pressing comes in. Sometimes you spend so much time organizing the strip and get it laid up on top of each other, it would have been faster just to go ahead and cut it. But generally, if it's pressed nicely before, you'll have better luck with that. So I'm going to get rid of my salvage. Off it goes. And now we are going to cut 8 5 inch. 2. And I do get the sneaky suspicion that I am going to have to do an extra strip just because of the width of my fat quarter, but that's okay. Got that bit done. There is my 8 5-inch rectangles. And now I'm going to line my other 2 strips up, and we need 8 2.5 by 7. So I know I am not going to get that out of my 4th strip. I am going to have to actually do a 5th strip from my fat quarter. So it's a good job that I did not take it too far away. Get rid of that. And now we're going to do 7 inches. There's 2. 4. Oh, woo, look at that. 6. Now that's cutting it really, really close. But that's okay. I still need 2 more. So I still need 1 more strip of my fat quarter. So I'm going to go ahead and cut another 2.5-inch strip of my fat quarter. Because I need 2 more 7s. Now I can take it off to the side. Get rid of my nasty little selvage there. And let's cut 2.5 by 7. Okay, got them. So the 2.5 by 5s, you're going to put them off to the side and label them G as in George. And the 2.5 by 7s, you're going to label them H as in Henry. Okay, last fabric. Now this next fabric, we don't need a whole lot of it. Seriously, I've been so used to doing those 24-inch blocks, it feels really weird cutting now for a 16-inch block. There just doesn't seem to be nearly enough fabric. But with this one, we just need a total of 8 3.5 by 3.5-inch squares. So just 1 strip if you're cutting with the fabric. If you're cutting a fat quarter, you're going to need 2. And I'm actually cutting from some miscellaneous bits and pieces yardage. I do have some width of fabric here, but I would like to see what I can get out of these 2 little miscellaneous pieces that I have here. I don't even think this is as wide as a fat quarter. So I'm just going to go ahead and cut up my little pieces. But what you need is, if you have, with the fabric, you need 1 3.5-inch strip. If you're cutting it from a fat quarter, you're going to need 2 3.5-inch strips. So cut up whatever you need, and I will do the same on mine. And I'm gonna fussy cut this one a little bit because it has lots of different colors in it, and I really want to try to keep the pinky peachy bits, and I want to use those as opposed to the taupey bits. So I'm going to be a little bit fussy cutting as I'm doing this. So go ahead and cut your 3.5-inch strips, which we will then cut into 3.5-inch squares. And I want to flip this around because I want that little bit of pink right there. Okay. So now from the bits and pieces, we want 3.5-inch squares. And we want 8 of them. So I'm going to just line my pieces of fabric up. Take a look and see if I got some of that pink. Yes, I do. I've got some of that lovely pink. Okay. Go ahead, get rid of the salvage. There. Okay. We are going to take those and we are going to label them J. J is in jam. Okay. All right, that's actually all the cutting done for this block, which didn't take very long. So now I'm just going to clean off my board here so that I have some room to work, and we are going to start piecing our block. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to grab our A's, B's, and C's. And what we're doing is making the little corner block that goes right up in the very corner. So we want to grab one of these, and we are going to sew a B to the left side of all of these. And we need a total of 8. So that'll be our first step. We're going to set up our machines for a 1/4 inch seam allowance. We're going to go ahead and we're going to just sew an A to a B. So off to the sewing machine. Okay, back from the sewing machine. Now we're going to take these to the ironing board and we are going to press them towards the B block. So that is pressing it towards this one here, the 1.5 by 2.5, so your background. So off we go to the ironing board, and still this really doesn't feel like enough pieces. So used to the bigger blocks. Okay, here we are back from the ironing board. Now before we go any further, let's just double check and make sure that our seam allowance is correct. So once these are pressed, they should measure 3 inches by 2 inches. And if they do, it's good. If not, you want to take a minute and just adjust your seam allowance. So if you're bigger than 3 inches, you want to increase your seam allowance. If you're smaller than 3 inches, you want to take a look and maybe decrease your seam allowance. So I would do that before I do the next step, but if all is well, now we're going to take piece number C, and we are going to put one on top of all of those so that we make this cute little block here. So that's our next step. Off we go to the sewing machine, grab your units you just made and your C's, and go ahead and put a C on top of all your A's and B's. Off to the sewing machine. Back we are again. We are now going to go off to the ironing board and we are going to press everything towards the C piece of fabric, so towards the background. That's our next step. Off we go back to the ironing board and press towards the C. Okay, back we are from the ironing board, and if all is well, these should measure 3 inches square. So if all is well and these measures 3 inches by 3 inches, we are now ready to add the next pieces to these. So we are going to grab our fabric D and E, which are these ones right here, and we want to start by being a little bit careful how we position this. We're going to put one of these on this side and one of these on that side. So you want to make sure that that isn't all the way up. I mean, it's still very, very pretty, but not the look we're going for. So you want to make sure that you are sewing the D to the right-hand side where you've got the gold down in the bottom corner. So that's our next step. We're going to take all 8 of these and we're going to sew to 8 of fabric number D. Just watch your placement. And back to the sewing machine. And we're back. So now we're going to take these pieces, we're going to go to the ironing board and we are going to press them towards the piece you just put on. So towards the fabric D. So that would be this one right here. So off to the ironing board. Okay, next step, we are going to sew the 5 inch, the 2.5 by 5 to the bottom like that. That's our next step. All 8 of these to all 8 of these. So off we go to the sewing machine. Back we are, and you can probably guess, we are going to go to the sewing machine and we are going to press towards this fabric right here that you just put on. And no, we're probably not going to do that at the sewing machine. We should probably try to do that at the ironing board. It wouldn't work if we tried to do it at the sewing machine. So off to the ironing board and press towards this fabric right here. So we'll be flipping this over and pressing towards this fabric. So off we go. And at this point, we should have a 5 inch square. If you just wanted to, again, double check to make sure that your seam allowance was looking all right, you should have a 5 inch square. And we are pretty darn good. So no changes at this point. Okay, now the last thing we need to do on this block is we need to add a couple of F squares to each of these 2 corners. So you want to make sure that you're orienting the block right so that you have the darker fabric on the outside. So your D and your E are facing this way. And we are going to take an F and we want to lay it across here and across here. And what we are going to do is we are going to grab a marker, draw on one diagonal on each of your 2.5 inch squares. Let's do that first. Let's draw the diagonal on first. So draw your diagonal. Oh, that one didn't work. Let's try another one. You want to make sure you're as accurate as possible. So go right from diagonal to diagonal. That's much better. And you're going to do that on the back of all of your F squares. Like so. And then you are going to put an F square in this corner and this corner. And then we're going to sew directly on top of the line. So when we flip these back, your block will look like this, which is a very cute little flowery looking block. So that's what we're going for. You're going to put an F square on each corner and just make sure you're putting them on the correct corners, which would be here and here. So that's our next job. We're going to take 16 of our F's off to the sewing machine and put one on each corner. Here we are, back. Now before we do this next step, verify that you have these on all the correct corners before we go ahead and do the next step, because what we're going to do is we're going to cut away this excess. So you grab your ruler, line it up the 1/4 inch, line that up on the line that you sewed, and cut. And you do that on both sides. So once you have verified that you are correct, go ahead and cut. And then we are going to go off to the ironing board and we are going to press towards the little pieces that you just put on. So we're going to press towards the F blocks. So off we go. Do your cutting, then do your pressing. And when that is done, that is the 4 corners of our quilt finished. Sort of. And we are ready to kind of move up to another unit. Okay, so off we go. Okay, there we go. We can put those off to the side for a moment. And now we are going to grab our 2.5 by 5s fabric G. And we are going to grab some more of our F's. And this time on the left-hand side of the block, we're going to line up an F so all your raw edges are aligned. And we are going to go and sew from diagonal to diagonal again. So draw a line. If you haven't already drawn a line on your squares, go ahead and draw your line, diagonal to diagonal. Line this up on the right-hand side of your rectangle, like so. Of course, right sides together, and then we're going to sew directly on top of that line. So when we're done, we want a block that looks like that. Okay, so that's our next step. Off to the sewing machine. Back from the sewing machine. So go ahead with all of these. Now verify first of all, before you cut that off, that you've got them going the correct direction. So we want to end up with a block that looks like this. So we have the majority of the darker fabric on the left, and this is on the right hand side, pointing up to the top right. So if you've got them that way, perfect. Cut off, leave a 1/4 inch, cut off the excess, off to the ironing board, and press towards this fabric right here. So that's next step. Verify, cut, and press. Off we go. Take all of those, once you're back from the ironing board, pop them off to the side. And now you want to grab your 7-inch plums. And we're going to use the rest of our J, but this time we want to put the J square on the left-hand side of the piece of fabric. Again, of course, right sides together. And we want to make sure we are sewing on this angle. So let me just draw that on the back of my square. Make sure that I'm right corner to corner. There we go. So I want to lay this down on the left-hand side of my 7-inch rectangle. And I want my line to be going from bottom left to top right so that we get the correct angle. We're going to do exactly the same thing. We're going to go ahead and we're going to sew directly on top of that line. And then once we get back from that, once you get those sewn, then we'll go back over to the ironing board. But let's get this sewn first. So off we go, off to the sewing machine. Okay, once again, go ahead and verify that you have the square on correctly. And we do, if it looks like this. And then off to the ironing board, you're going to cut this excess off, press towards this fabric right here. So go ahead, that's our next step. Verify, cut, press. Off we go. And we're back. So now let's grab all those pieces that we've previously made. And we're going to take the little tulip. And we want to start by sewing that one there and this one here. So you're going to start by sewing the first unit that we made, this first unit that we made, to the second unit that we made. Put them together, line them up, and sew right sides together. Okay, so the goal is that you will have this V-shaped piece right here. Right, we don't want them to be like this. Make sure they're looking like that. Right there. So that's our next job. Off to the iron or sewing machine. So all 8 of these together. And here I am back from the sewing machine. Now I would have really liked it a little bit better if we had an opposing seam for when we put these together. So I actually went ahead and just flipped this seam with my finger so that we had opposing seams. And I'll just repress that when I go to the ironing board. Now I don't know if that's going to give us an issue later on in the quilt if there's a flipped over seam, but I'm going to take that chance for now. So go ahead, cut these all apart, off to the ironing board, and we are going to press towards the unit that we just put on. So we want to press towards this unit right here. Okay, and if you do what I do or did what I did and you have to repress that seam, just go right ahead and do it. And we'll worry about it later. Off to the ironing board. Back from the ironing board. Next job is to sew this one to the bottom of the entire unit. So you're just going to sew that one on, right sides together. Again, we want to have that V of the background fabric, and these will roughly visually line up. So that's our next step. All 8 of these to the bottom of all 8 of these. And that's our corner blocks completely done. And there's really not a whole lot to assembling the center of this quilt. So we're getting there. All right, here we are back from the sewing machine. And I kind of did the same thing this time that I did last time, is I forced that one seam over. So I'll do a little bit of repressing. But we have to press anyway. And we are going to press towards this block right here, the one that we just put on. So that is our next step. Off to the ironing board. Okay, here we are back from the ironing board. And we're just going to lay those out and put them aside for a minute so that we can continue with the center of the block. So now what we're going to do, so we're going to grab all those fabric I, J, and K. And that one goes in the middle. Okay, so this is the center of our block and how we're going to lay it out. So the first thing we want to do, and now these are the 3.5 inch squares, these ones here, and these are the 3.5 by 4s. Those are your background, and you might want to make sure they're on the outside. So to create this, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to take all the I's and J's and we're going to sew them together in pairs. So grab all of those and we'll have 8 pairs. And so that's our first step. Go ahead and take all your I's and J's, sew them together in pairs. Off to the sewing machine. Okay, great. Take all of these, cut them apart, assuming you chain pieced. And we are going to press all of these towards the J. So they're going to go all towards the 3.5-inch square. So this right here is your J. So everything towards that. Off to the sewing machine, off to the ironing board. Now I have just come back from the ironing board, pressing these units here. And I thought I would lay the block out because although I'm seeing some really pretty little pink highlights in here, I don't think now that I see this block together that I have enough contrast between this fabric and this fabric. So before I go any further and make it a more difficult block to change, I am going to change out this fabric and swap it for something else. And there's nothing wrong with doing that and thinking, oh yeah, this looks really great, and then you get to this like, I don't know, I don't like it so much. Especially with if it's a contrast thing. If there's more contrast, I would leave it in, but there's just not enough. So I am going to cut myself some more 3.5-inch squares, and I'm going to replace this fabric right here. Well, there we go. That's a whole lot better. I have much better contrast now, and I like that color. Very rarely do I change my mind on a fabric that I have, but that one just did not have anywhere near enough contrast. Okay, so now I'm going to go to the sewing machine. I'm going to sew all of these together into pairs, and then we can get it ready to assemble the block. So that's the next step. Off to the sewing machine. I'm going to sew all of these into pairs. Here I am, back from the sewing machine. Now we're going to take all of these and press them towards this block right here. So this is your background block. This would be your patterned block or your block number J. So press everything towards J. Off we go to the sewing ironing board. Okay. Here we are. Now we're going to lay these down. Okay. So we're going to sew these three together, these three together, and these three together. And then we'll sew the rows together. So that's our next job. Off to the sewing machine. Sew this one together, this one together, this one together. There we are, back from the sewing machine. Now we're going to head to the ironing board, and we are going to press these seams out, these seams in, these seams out, and then we're going to sew the rows together. So these ones out, these ones in, these ones out. Off we go. And there we go. That is block number 4. Now, just before I go, see where I had to pick out a seam here earlier? Do you know what this little ball on the top of your seam ripper is for? That's for pulling those little threads out. See how that pulls them out for you? That's what that's for, just in case you didn't know. Okay, now stay tuned and we will work on the next block for this month. Oh, one more quick thing. Label these block number 4 and put them away.
Let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to the lobby to get ourselves a treat.
Okay, now that we have block number 4 done, we are ready to switch gears and go to block number 13. So for block number 13, you're going to need a fat eighth of this color, or well, whatever color you want, but you need a fat eighth of it. Background, I'm going to use my pale gray on the black background again for this block, and you need a fat quarter. For the lighter, or the aqua, we're looking at a fat eighth, and for the indigo, you just need a 10 by 10 square. So this one is fabric number 13, 27, 17, and fabric number 23. So assemble those fabrics and let's get started with the cutting. Okay, so this is the block that we're making right here. It's an 8 by 8 finished, and we're going to make 3 of them. Okay, we're going to start with fabric number 13, which in this case mine happens to be the green. Now if you are cutting from a fat quarter, you're going to need 2 and a little bit strips. So 3 strips if you're cutting from a fat quarter. If you're cutting from width of fabric, we need 1 full strip plus just a little bit more. So we actually need a total of 48 inches of fabric, and a strip is usually 40, so you need a full strip and a little bit. Now we're going to be cutting 1.5 inch strips. So that will be our first chore. Let's just make sure that this end is nice and straight, and it is. I've obviously cut this with a rotary cutter at some point. Okay, so to subcut this, we want 12 1 1/2 inch squares, and we want 12 1.5 by 2.5, because we are making 3 of these blocks. So we need to triple the cuts in the book. So I'm just going to lay 2 strips on top of one another. It makes it just a wee bit quicker. Okay, so whenever you do that, spend a little bit of time making sure they're laid perfectly on top of one another, and make sure that your ends are equal down in here. Now go ahead and cut 12 1 1/2 inch squares. 4, 6, 8, 10, and 12. And now we want 12 2.5s. And I don't think I'm going to be able to sneak another 2.5 at it. No, because I got some salvage there, so no go. No go on those ones. Okay, so grab another set. Now those were, I got 8. I only need 4 more. So I am actually going to be able to get that out of my 3rd strip. Because of the width of my fabric, I'm not going to need that 4th strip. So that's kind of nice. I'm going to keep that and put it back in my bag. Get rid of that salvage. There. That gives me my 12 pieces. So the 1.5 by 1.5, we are going to label them A. And the 1.5 by 2.5, we're going to label them C as in cat. Put them off to the side. You're done with the green, and now we can actually get into cutting the background. So grab your background. Now for your background fabric, the best use of the fabric is to cut 2 2.5 inch with the fabric strips and 1 1.5 inch with the fabric strip. And that is your best use of fabric. So let's go ahead and cut 2 2.5s. And 1 1.5. Okay, take the rest, put it away. So we're going to start with cutting the 2.5 inch strips and lay the first one out. Now we are going to cut this one into 1.5 inch slices, and we need 36 of them. Apparently my dog is not happy that I have locked him out of my sewing room for now. There's 16. Four. How am I making to get out of here? Oh, another 4. Grab your other 2.5. Get rid of your salvage and finish cutting until you have 36 2.5 by 1.5. So I got 28 out of my first strip. So before we go any further, what I want to do is I want to cut my 2.5s first before I continue cutting my 1.5s, because I will be able to get some of the 1.5 by 2.5s out of the leftover strip here. So I don't want to cut myself shy on my 2.5. So we have that. Cut the salvage off. And now what I want to do is do 12 2.5s. And then we'll finish cutting up our 1.5s just to try to make it a little bit better use of the fabric. 4, 6, 8. Okay. There's my 12 2.5 by 2.5. So now I'm going to continue cutting the rest of this strip into 2.5 by 1.5. And I believe that I need 8 more pieces. So we will have no problem getting that out of this. There. There's my 36. So we have 36 1.5 by 2.5 and 12 2.5 by 2.5. So now you're going to take your 1.5 inch strip and we are going to cut this into 24 1.5 by 1.5 squares. So continue with that cutting until you have 24 1.5 by 1.5 inch squares. There, how's that for best use of the fabric? Ooh, not much left at all. That's a good thing. Okay, so your 1.5 inch, your 1.5 by 2.5, we're going to label them B, put them off to the side. Your 2.5 by 2.5, we're going to label them D, and these little fellas are going to be E. Okay, so now we are ready to grab our aqua print, or fabric number 17, and from here we want another fat quarter that needs to have a press before I do anything with it. Off to the ironing board I go. Okay, so from the aqua print, now I'm cutting from a fat quarter. Well, it used to be a fat quarter till I took a little nibble out of the corner. That's okay. I don't need that. We don't need to worry about that today. I still have plenty. So what we're going to do, if you are cutting from a fat quarter, you're going to need 2 2.5 inch strips. If you're cutting from a width of fabric, you will just need 1 2.5 inch strip. And since I'm cutting from a fat quarter, I need 2. Then I can put that away. Now from these strips right here, let's go ahead and just double them up. We are going to cut 12 2.5 inch squares. So again, make sure they're perfectly lined up on top of one another. We don't want to, at this point, I mean, if they're not perfectly lined up on top of one another, you're going to have some accuracy issues when it comes to the size of the block. So make sure that they're lined up on top of one another. And if you want to cut singly, that's perfectly okay too. You don't have to do 2 strips. It's whatever your comfort level is. You just, as I've said before, you don't want to do too many layers thick, because the thicker the layers you're cutting through, the more accuracy you're going to start losing. Because the fabric starts to move around a little bit more, and you know, if you're really trying to cut something super thick, the pieces on the bottom are just going to kind of slide away and they won't be accurate at all. There's 8, 2 more. Well, I mean like 4 more for a total of 12. There we go. Total of 12 of those, and we are going to label them F as in Frank. And off they go. And last but not least, we have our indigo center, or our fabric number 23. And on this, we just need 4 2.5 inch squares. So it all depends. If you're doing a 2.5 is a really nice size to have kind of in your stash to do things. So you know, if you're cutting from a fat quarter, just cut a whole 2.5 inch strip. You're not going to need it all, but 2.5 is a good size to have. Same as if you're cutting from width of fabric. If you have plenty of fabric, cut a full 2.5. You'll use that 2.5 somewhere. So 1 2.5 inch strip, and all we need out of this is 4 2.5 inch squares. No, actually we only need 3, because we're doing 3 blocks, not 4 blocks. So we just need 3 2.5 inch squares. So That's even better. Two and a half. And one more 2.5. So now I'm going to label this strip 2.5 inches, and I'm going to put it back into my stash because we'll probably use it somewhere else in this quilt. So hang on to that, but it's nice that the strip is labeled because then you know what it is right in your stash bin. So I'm just going to put mine away. And now we are ready to start piecing this block. So we are going to start with the A squares and some of the B's. So we're going to take, we've done this before, take a B. We are going to put an A and draw a line on the back of the A from one diagonal all the way across. And then you're going to take that and you are going to stick it on the right hand side of your 2.5 by 1, your B block. You're going to stick it right on the side, and we are going to sew from bottom left to top right on the A block. So, and you're going to sew directly on top of that line. So you're going to do that with all 12 of your A blocks. So you just want to make sure that you take 12 of your B's. So take care of that, off to the sewing machine, draw a line, sew from corner to corner, and then we will come back and do some pressing. Back from the sewing machine, there's my little fella, and I'm just going to cut these apart. So this not being our first rodeo, we know what we're going to do with these, right? We are going to take these, double check to make sure you're going the right way, and you are, as long as you're pointing down this way. We're going to cut this excess off and then press these, and we're going to press them towards this fabric right here. So verify everything is good. If it's good, cut and press. And do that with all 12 of these little dickens. There is such a difference between working with 24-inch blocks and working with these little fellas. There we go. Okay, so off to the ironing board. Now when you get back from the ironing board, we're just going to take these and put these little guys off to the side. We actually don't need those for a few minutes. And we are now going to seam kind of the same thing, but with the B's and the C's. And C blocks we also have 12, so you'll take 12 of your B's. And we are going to put these together similar to how we put binding together. So you want to lay this one, so we want to have the B facing up, and we're going to take a C and put it on the end so that all the raw edges here are lining up, and we are going to draw a line, top left, bottom right, and then we're going to sew directly on top of that line. Okay, so what we want to do is make 12 of these. So you continue laying that down. The tricky part here is you want to make sure that you have the diagonal going from here directly into this corner. And we normally have a visual when we're doing that with half square triangles, but we don't really have a visual here. So I'm just kind of moving mine off to the side a little bit, drawing my line, making sure it's right there, and then I'm just going to slide that over. And that way I make sure that I'm right down into this corner, because you want to make sure you're right down into that corner right there. Okay, so that's our next step. Go ahead and draw lines on 12 of these, and then off to the sewing machine. And we're back. So as always, we'll just cut a couple of these things apart. Verify that you are correct, and that it's going to look like this. And that's the look we're going for, with the diagonal going from left to right. So if you are correct, go ahead and trim these down. Just line up your ruler on that 1/4 inch line that you drew. Take off a 1/4, and then off to the ironing board. There we go. So do that with all 12 of these, and then off to the ironing board. And we are going to press towards this fabric right here. So press towards that fabric. Okay, off we go. Okay, back from the ironing board. Grab the first little units we made, and now we also want the D squares, and we are going to make a little unit that looks like this. So another one of those little tulip type units that we've made before. So your first step is to sew one of these, our first units, to the D block. Just go ahead and sew those together to all 12 of these, and then we are going to head out to the ironing board. So first step, line these up together and off to the sewing machine. So take this one, flip it over, just like so. Okay, off to the sewing machine. And we're back. So now you're going to take this little guy over to the ironing board, and we are going to press towards this unit right here, this one right here. Press towards that one, and then we will do the next step. There we go. Now, our next step is to, put one of these on the bottom of each of those. So we make this cute little tulip block. So that'll be our next step. Grab all of these, take them off to the sewing machine, and you want to line one of those up like so, and stitch that down with your 1/4 inch seam allowance. So back to the sewing machine we go. And we're back. So now we're going to head over to the ironing board, and we're going to press this towards the piece we just put on. And what you should have is your 1/4 inch seam allowance right over here. So the block should look like that. And we're going to press it towards this. So head over to your ironing board, and then we are ready to make the next unit for this block. So off we go, and we're back. Now we can put these units off to the side, and we're ready to make the next units. So grab your fabric F, and we want to bring in all those other little 1.5 inch squares, and we are going to make kind of like a square in 2 squares. So we're going to draw a line on the back of all the 1.5 inch pieces, like so. Oh, do a better job than that though. Try to get right to corner. More like that. That's better. And we're going to take those and line them up in the left-hand corner of all 12 of these. And then we're going to sew directly on top of that line. And this is what we'll end up with. So might as well mark all of these because we're going to have to eventually. And then 12 of them off to the sewing machine, and put one of these in the top left-hand corner of each of these. So that's our next job. Off we go. There we are. Cut these apart, and then what you're going to do is, like we always do, line up on that line that you've sewn with the 1/4 inch, and we are going to cut away that excess. And then off the ironing board and press towards the little triangle in the top corner. Press towards that. So that's our next step. Cut and press. I bet you all know what we're going to do next. We are now going to take one of these, and we're going to stick it in this corner. Line up your raw edges, so from top left to bottom right, and when you're finished you will have a unit that looks like this. So grab the rest of your 1.5 inch, and off we go to the sewing machine. Back again. Now we're going to take these, cut off the excess, and press towards the triangle. So that's the next step. Cut off all your excess and press towards your triangle. Now our last step is to grab our fabric B, and we are going to put them on the top of this block. So you're just going to go ahead, line up all those raw edges, and sew across with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And where these seams converge, right here, should be your 1/4 inch so that you don't lose your points. So go ahead and sew those on, all 12 of those, to all 12 of these. Off we go. And we're back. Okay, now you're going to take these and press these towards this fabric right here. So grab all of those, and that's where we're going to press next. And then that is the final unit that we need to make, and we're ready to start assembling this block. So off to the ironing board, and then we can assemble the block. There we go. We are now ready to start assembling this block. So grab your G fabric. There we go. And we're going to need 4 of these, the units we just made. Like so. And then 4 of the first unit that we had made. Like so. And don't forget, we're making 3 of these. There we go. So this row together, this row together, this row together, and then we'll sew those, all the rows together. So again, we're making 3 of these. So this row, this row, this row. Off to the sewing machine. And we're back. So now what we want to do is just head over to the ironing board, and we are going to press these seams out, these seams in, these seams out, and then we can join our blocks together. So next step, off the ironing board, in, in, and then join. And there we go. 3 more blocks done. Okay, so go ahead, marvel at how adorable and cute those blocks are, and then go ahead and label them block number 13 and put them into your bin. And we are done for this month. So everybody have an amazing month. Hopefully I'll see you on the Zoom call. Bye for now. Happy sewing.